began both to do and to teach, until the time that he was taken up. All right, so the book of Acts doesn't identify himself, okay? But he identifies himself this way: Theophilus, I wrote to you before. Well, do we have any other book where we say that any book of the New Testament was written to anyone by the name of Theophilus? All right, let's go to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, and let's start at verse 1. And really, what we're going to do here, and we'll take a little bit of time. I don't want to spend all the time demonstrating Luke is the writer of both the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Nevertheless, we're going to spend some time anyway. All right, Luke chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. For as much then as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they deliver them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Everybody have the word eyewitnesses right there? Eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Well, those eyewitnesses, that's referring to the apostles. They were eyewitnesses, okay? So even as they delivered them unto us, from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. I wish we had time to talk about the word eyewitness. Our English word autopsy comes from the Greek word that's translated eyewitness here, and it's only used one time. Here's a question. The word autopsy, in what field of science or what career field would you consider autopsy today? Where would you place it? Medical, forensic, medical, right? Okay. Just hold on to that. Verse 3, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding, all right, full knowledge of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent who? Theophilus. So, whoever wrote the book of Luke, and the writer of the book of Luke doesn't identify himself as Luke. Okay, that's who we have been taught wrote the book of Luke, and rightly so. But it's written to Theophilus. And he is starting, we have the declaration of John the Baptist's birth, and from chapter 1, verse 5 through 252 in the book of Luke is proclamations, praise, and prophecy. The proclamation of John's birth, the proclamation of Jesus' birth, praise of John's birth, the praise concerning Mary, the praise concerning Jesus, and then prophecy, the prophecy of what John would do, the prophecy that John was a fulfillment of, Isaiah chapter 40, the prophecy concerning Jesus and what he would accomplish. So that's kind of that opening, and then it gets into the life of Christ, the ministry of Christ until his passion and resurrection in chapter 22 through 24, and then his ascension. Okay, so everything that Jesus began to do and to teach until the time that he was taken up, that's what we have a record of in the book of Luke. All right, go back to Acts chapter 1. Remember, Luke was written to a man named Theophilus, and what was in the book of Luke was everything that Jesus did and everything that he taught until the time that he was taken up. So Acts chapter 1, verse 1. The former treatise, writing, letter, have I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach, until the day in which he was taken up. That's the book of Luke. Okay? So whoever wrote the book of Luke wrote the book of Acts. Yes, sir? So Theophilus was, some people suggest, well, that was just a made-up name. No, because notice how he's addressed in chapter 1 of Luke, most excellent Theophilus. In Acts, toward the end of the book, Festus and Felix, most excellent Festus, most excellent Felix. So he's addressed with someone who perhaps was an official, so to speak. Who he was, we don't know. Other than he was a real person. He was someone who was a friend of God, who loved God. How do we know that? Well, what's the name? Theophilus, which that's what the meaning of the name is, friend of God. And he also is one who was a man who believed. When you read that introduction, the purpose of the book of Luke was to help build the faith of this man. He already had that great faith, but this letter, this book was to strengthen that faith, to build up that faith in Theophilus. So we only know he was a man of the first century who was a Christian who received 2 letters from Luke. Now, I say Luke, but that's just according to card number 1. So how would I be able to, from the scriptures, show, well, Luke wrote Luke, and Luke wrote Acts. And I know Luke wrote Acts because Luke wrote Luke. And Luke wrote Luke and addressed it to Theophilus, and the Acts is addressed to Theophilus, so Luke, who wrote Luke, also wrote Acts. But I don't know that Luke wrote Luke because Luke didn't say, I wrote Luke. So how do we know? Kind of figure-eighted all that right there. Yes, sir? Okay, there's where we're going. So here's what you have in, whenever you're looking at books of the Bible, all right, there's internal evidence. You know, how do we know that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians? Well, there's internal evidence. What I mean by that, we have in Acts chapter 17, Paul in Thessalonica, the things that he dealt with, what he was confronted with, how he was persecuted, how he had to leave. Then we read in 1 Thessalonians, whoever wrote that book had an intimate knowledge of the work in Thessalonica, of what had happened to Paul in Thessalonica. Right? That's some internal evidence that indicates he was the writer. Not only that, but he claims to be the writer. Paul, Silas, and Timothy. All right? He claims to be the writer. And also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, about verse 18, he said, wherefore we would have come to you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us. So he claims to be the writer. You can also see this. There are certain words that are unique to Paul. You know, if I were to go to a box, probably in the closet in my house, and I'd dig around, I'd probably come to a box. I don't know what size it would be, Miss Loretta, but I'm going to look in there, and there's going to be some letters that date back 20, 25 years that my wife has. Now, if I were to get some of those letters out and start reading them, I might be a bit red-faced from some of the things there, but they're letters that I wrote to her. And you're going to see that there are certain words that I would use that you're like, well, if I wrote a letter, I wouldn't use that word. It's letters that's unique to me. Is it the case that maybe you've heard me in the pulpit and I'll use a particular phrase and you kind of look at each other and say, yeah, he's from Tennessee? Okay? So I was raised up here in particular terminology. Any of you know what a frog strangler is? A frog strangler? It's a heavy rain. Well, you know, back in Tennessee, when it come rain, man, it's going to be a frog strangler. Well, I could say that to some folks, and they'd be like, a frog? What are you talking about, a frog strangler? See, I'm going to use certain words based off of where I was raised up, based off of what the people that I've been around and the culture that I was brought up in, based on my education. You know, you're probably never going to hear me use words that some man with a PhD uses or a doctorate level education uses, because I don't know that much. But I'm going to speak a little bit more clear, a little bit more plain, kind of country, kind of rural. All right? Well, Paul uses particular words, and you say, wow, this is a lot like this letter, and a lot like this letter, and a lot like this letter. And we know for sure Paul wrote these letters, okay, internal evidence. Same, and I said all that to say this. Same way with Acts, and the same way with Luke. If we were to take the book of John and read it, and then read the book of Luke, we'd say, these look like 2 different people wrote these letters. Well, they did. John had a particular education. What was John's education? What was his training? What was his background? He was a fisherman. Didn't necessarily have a